He was a powerful, cold-hearted CEO rushing to another board meeting, until he noticed two boys holding up their sick brother on the sidewalk, and everything he thought he cared about stopped making sense. Henry Stewart was a man who walked like time owed him something. Each morning began with silence, speed, and structure. His days were mapped in minutes, not hours, and his mind was always 5 steps ahead of the present. That morning, like every other, he moved through the business district with his phone in one hand and his purpose sharpened to a point. He barely noticed the people he passed or the early spring wind tugging at the corners of his tailored blue suit. He had a 9 a.m. meeting with international investors, a 10:15 call with legal, and a dozen things in between that would keep his empire humming. He was halfway to his waiting car when something unusual stopped him. It wasn't the sound, there was always noise in the city, but a strange stillness just off the edge of his vision. At the far corner near the entrance to a coffee shop, he saw them. 3 boys. One was visibly weak, barely upright, and leaning heavily on the shoulders of the other 2. The sight was so out of place it jarred something loose in him. The boys looked alike, same age, same narrow faces, same dark brown hair and pale skin. The only difference was that the smallest one seemed to be in pain, his face twisted with effort as he tried to keep moving. Henry frowned. He didn't do interruptions. But something made him pause. He stepped closer, ignoring the impatient buzz of his phone. "Hey," he said, his voice low but firm. "What's going on here? Is he hurt?" The taller of the 2 supporting boys glanced up at him. There was fear in his expression, but also something else, exhaustion, maybe, or defiance. "He's sick," the boy said quietly. "His stomach hurts real bad." Henry crouched slightly to see the boy better. "You need to get him to a hospital." "Why are you out here like this?" The second boy, quieter than the first, shifted his weight and answered, "We can't go. We don't have money. And we don't have anyone." Henry's breath caught for a second, though he didn't show it. "Where are your parents?" The first boy answered, steady but sad. "Our mom died a few months ago. We don't know who our dad is. It's just us." His words were calm, practiced even, like he had explained it too many times. Henry stood silently, processing the information. His instincts screamed to move on. He had no idea who these boys were. This wasn't his problem. But something inside him, something he didn't recognize, tightened sharply at the image before him. They weren't asking for anything. They hadn't begged. They just stood there, carrying their sick brother down a crowded sidewalk with nowhere to go and no one to help them. Henry took a deep breath, glanced at the time, and for the first time in years, ignored his schedule. "Come with me," he said. "You're not doing this alone." The boys hesitated for a second, unsure if they should trust him, but eventually nodded. One on each side, still holding their brother, they followed him as he flagged down a taxi. As they climbed into the car, Henry looked at the smallest boy's face again. He was pale, sweating, and clearly in pain, but not crying. That was what struck Henry most of all. Not one of them had cried. They didn't act like kids. They acted like survivors. He sat back in the taxi seat, heart pounding with something that felt like urgency. It had been years since Henry Stewart had deviated from his carefully calculated routine. But this time, the detour felt like it might lead somewhere that mattered. The taxi ride to the clinic was tense and quiet. Henry gave the driver the address of a private hospital he occasionally used for executives and their families, a place that rarely dealt with cases like this. As the car moved through traffic, Henry glanced at the boys beside him. The sick one, Joshua, as the others soon told him, was drifting in and out of consciousness, his head resting against his twin brother Logan's shoulder. The third boy, Sam, sat closest to Henry, eyes darting between the city outside and his brother's pale face. They were holding themselves together with a kind of discipline that Henry recognized not from childhood but from adulthood. They didn't fidget. They didn't complain. They just watched. It was deeply unsettling. When they arrived at the clinic, the receptionist started to speak but stopped the moment she saw Henry. He gave her one look and said simply, "Emergency. Pediatric. Now." She buzzed them through. Doctors took Joshua immediately, placing him on a stretcher and rolling him down the hall with swift efficiency. A nurse asked for information, name, age, medical history, and the boys answered together in short, practiced bursts. Their mother's name was Abby. She had died 3 months ago. The boys didn't know their exact birthdays, just that they were all 10. They'd been staying in a shelter on and off since Abby passed, until they were told there wasn't room anymore. They had been on the street for 2 days. Henry sat in the waiting area with Logan and Sam as the staff worked on Joshua. The walls were white and sterile, decorated with soft pastel prints meant to calm children. The room felt too quiet, too clean, too far from where these boys had come from. Henry didn't know what to say to them. They weren't crying. They weren't asking questions. Logan was sitting stiffly, like someone in a job interview. Sam, smaller by an inch or two, kept rubbing the sleeves of his oversized hoodie between his fingers. Eventually, Henry asked, "Do you have any other family?" Logan shook his head. "Just each other." His voice was thin but even. "Do you know your father's name?" Henry asked. Logan looked down. "No. Mom never told us. She said he left before we were born. That's all we know." Henry nodded slowly. He felt like he was standing in the middle of someone else's life, trying to figure out what page he'd entered on. He leaned back in his chair, trying to steady the noise in his head. This wasn't a moment he could ignore anymore. He had already crossed a line, he had brought them here, he had stepped in, and now, whether he admitted it or not, he was part of whatever happened next. 2 hours passed before the doctor came back. Joshua had been diagnosed with acute appendicitis. He needed surgery, but the team was confident they had caught it in time. Henry stood when he heard the word surgery, already reaching into his coat for his wallet, out of habit, as if money was the most important thing he could offer. The doctor waved him off. "We'll need a guardian to authorize the procedure," she said. Henry hesitated, then said, "List me. I'll take responsibility." The paperwork was swift, his name and signature carrying enough weight to bypass usual protocols. Once Joshua was in surgery, Henry returned to the waiting room, where the twins were still seated in silence. He sat down between them. "Your brother's going to be okay," he said quietly. Logan let out a breath. Sam nodded but didn't say anything. The silence that followed wasn't uncomfortable. It was almost companionable. As the sky outside darkened, Henry made a phone call. He didn't explain much to his assistant, only that his day was over and he would not be coming in the next morning. He ended the call and looked at the boys. "You're not going back to the street," he said. "Not tonight. Not ever, if I can help it." The word surprised even him. But they felt right. They felt final. Logan looked at him, unsure if he believed it. "Why are you helping us?" he asked. Henry paused. Then, for the first time that day, he gave them the truth. "Because someone should have helped you already. And no one did." Neither boy responded. But both leaned slightly toward him, not enough to be obvious, but enough for Henry to feel it. That night, he stayed with them until the surgery was done and Joshua was resting. Then he called for a car, and instead of giving the address to his penthouse, he gave the name of a nearby hotel. He wasn't ready to take them home. But he wasn't walking away. The hotel suite was quiet when they arrived, too large for 3 children and a man who still didn't know how to be what they might need. Henry had reserved it under a false name, unsure of what the legal process required, but knowing that these boys couldn't return to the streets. He watched Logan and Sam step cautiously inside, eyes scanning the furniture like it might not be real. They didn't ask for food or toys or even where they would sleep. They sat down on the edge of one of the beds, close together, waiting for direction. It hit Henry then how little they expected from anyone. He called room service and ordered simple things: mac and cheese, apples, orange juice. While they waited, he took out his laptop, not to check on business but to search for social services procedures, emergency guardianship laws, anything that might guide him through what was quickly becoming a life-altering decision. Joshua was still in the hospital under observation, recovering well after surgery, and the hospital agreed to keep him for at least another day. But after that, they would expect answers, papers, names, next of kin. Henry had none of those. The food arrived, and Sam, the quieter of the two, whispered thank you before they ate. Logan didn't speak much, but he kept glancing at Henry as if trying to figure out whether this man could be trusted. Henry didn't try to explain himself. Instead, he sat nearby and watched them eat, noting how quickly they cleaned their plates, how they saved part of their juice as if it needed to last longer. It made his stomach knot. Later, he offered them a shower and pajamas, hotel robes, the only soft thing available in their size. Sam smiled for the first time when he found slippers in the closet and said they looked like marshmallows. Henry helped lay out a few extra pillows on the bed and sat at the desk while they got ready. When he looked up, they were curled under the covers together, whispering quietly. He stood, walked over, and asked if they needed anything else. Logan looked up at him, serious and small, and asked, "Can you stay in the room with us?" It was the first time he'd asked for anything directly. Henry nodded and sat in the armchair by the window. He left the lights low and listened as their whispers faded into steady breathing. The room grew still, and for the first time in years, so did he. He didn't know what tomorrow would bring. He didn't know what to do about the DNA test burning a hole in the back of his mind, the test he'd quietly ordered when the hospital asked if there was a family member to match the boys' medical records. Something about the way they looked, the way their mother's name felt familiar, had unsettled him. And now the possibility that they weren't just strangers, but his own blood, hung heavy in the air. He didn't want to believe it until he had proof. And yet, even as the logical part of his brain told him to wait, to protect himself, his body had already moved. He'd already stayed. He'd already fed them, brought them into his space, signed paperwork at the hospital as though they were his. He'd already chosen them. That night, while the city blinked outside the windows and the boys slept soundly in a place that didn't feel like theirs yet, Henry leaned his head back and closed his eyes, the quiet of the room wrapping around him. For the first time in years, he felt the weight of his life not as pressure, but as potential. Not as something to manage, but as something to share. And it terrified him, how much he already cared. The following morning, Henry woke before the sun, just as he always had. But instead of checking his email or scanning financial reports, he simply sat in the armchair by the window and watched the sky lighten over the city skyline. The room was still dim, quiet except for the soft, rhythmic breathing of the two boys still asleep in the bed. They hadn't moved much during the night. Logan's arm was stretched protectively across Sam's chest, and their heads were tilted slightly toward each other, like even in sleep they needed to stay connected. Henry had always thought of silence as a tool, something he used to stay in control, but now it felt like a space he didn't quite know how to fill. When the boys woke, it was slow and groggy. They didn't spring up or stretch like most children might. Instead, they blinked a few times, sat up cautiously, and looked at Henry to see if they were still allowed to be there. He nodded and asked if they were hungry. Sam gave a tiny nod in return, and Logan muttered something about pancakes. Henry picked up the hotel phone and placed the order without hesitation, then turned back to them. "You're safe here," he said, not because it was expected, but because he needed to hear himself say it out loud. Sam blinked at him, and Logan just watched him, quiet but alert. While they ate, Henry opened his laptop again and pulled up the lab results he had received earlier that morning. The DNA report was clear and irrefutable. The boys were his. All three. There wasn't even a question. The mother, Abby Monroe, had listed no father on any records. But she hadn't lied. She had simply left the space blank. As Henry stared at the screen, he felt the full force of reality settle over him like a second skin. These children weren't just a moral obligation or a strange coincidence. They were his sons. He sat with the knowledge for a long time before he said anything. After breakfast, when Logan and Sam were sitting on the floor drawing with hotel pens on the notepad from the nightstand, Henry spoke carefully. "Do you remember your mother talking about someone named Henry?" Logan looked up immediately. "She did once. She said that was your name. But she told us not to try and find you. Said you were gone a long time ago." Henry's breath caught, but he nodded slowly. "She and I knew each other. A long time ago. I didn't know about you. Not until now." Logan didn't say anything, but Sam looked at him with a strange intensity, like he was trying to solve a puzzle. "Are you our dad?" he asked, the words soft and clear. Henry took a moment, then said, "Yes. I am." The moment hung in the air. Logan's expression didn't change much, but his hand stilled on the paper. Sam tilted his head and said, "Okay," as if accepting something that had already begun to feel true. Later that afternoon, they visited Joshua in the hospital. He was awake, groggy, but smiling at the sight of his brothers. When Logan told him the news, Joshua didn't respond with shock. Instead, he just said, "I thought so," and reached for Henry's hand. The touch wasn't hesitant. It was small, warm, and full of quiet belief. Henry hadn't known what kind of father he would be, hadn't even considered that he might be one, but in that moment, with all three boys looking at him like they wanted him to stay, he made a decision. He wasn't going to fix everything overnight. He couldn't erase the years they had spent alone. But he could show up. He could stay. That evening, they returned to the hotel together. Joshua was discharged with strict recovery instructions, and Henry carried him into the suite like he weighed nothing at all. He let the boys watch cartoons late into the night and didn't care that they left crumbs on the sheets or scattered socks across the floor. They fell asleep piled together, not because they had to, but because that's where they felt safest. Henry stood in the doorway for a long time, watching them. He didn't recognize the version of himself he was becoming, but he didn't fear him either. He just knew this, the life he had built had never truly belonged to him. But this one, the one with crayons on the table and tiny feet on the carpet, might. And for the first time, that was enough. The next few days passed in a blur that felt both strangely calm and entirely unfamiliar to Henry. Each morning began not with meetings or market updates, but with three small boys tumbling around a hotel room, trying to decide who got to pick the breakfast. Joshua was recovering well from his surgery, still a little weak and sore, but strong enough to argue over cartoons and insist on sitting in the middle whenever they watched movies. Logan had begun to relax, though cautiously. He still scanned the room before entering, still made sure everyone had what they needed before serving himself, still glanced at Henry like he was waiting for the rules to change. Sam, the smallest and quietest, had become the most curious. He followed Henry around the room, asked questions about his watch, about why he always wore the same shoes, about whether his tie had to match his socks. Henry had moved them into a long-stay suite with a kitchenette and 2 bedrooms. It wasn't a permanent solution, but it gave them space to breathe. He bought clothes for each of them, not from high-end stores but from practical ones, letting the boys help choose colors and styles. It surprised him how quickly they took to organizing their drawers and arguing over who got which shelf in the mini fridge. They were children, after all, and despite everything they'd been through, the spark of play still lived inside them. But the truth of their connection, the DNA results, the fact that they were his sons, pressed deeper into his chest with each passing hour. He had told them, and they had accepted it with a kind of quiet resilience. But he hadn't yet decided what to do about it publicly. The world he came from was sharp and fast and rarely kind. Announcing that he had 3 10-year-old children with no warning, no backstory, and no plan would draw attention he wasn't ready for. But hiding them felt worse. The thought of sending them anywhere else, of placing them in some system where he wasn't allowed to be part of their daily lives, made his throat close. He began working with a lawyer who specialized in private guardianship cases. The process would be complicated, especially since Abby had left no legal documentation. No will. No custody designation. Just a letter found in a folder of school papers, written in her neat, slanted handwriting, that read, "If anything happens to me, please try to find their father. His name is Henry." He wasn't cruel. Just gone. When Henry read those words, he sat still for nearly an hour. Gone. Not bad. Not absent on purpose. Just gone. It wasn't forgiveness, but it wasn't blame either. It was an honest truth from a woman who had raised their sons alone, who had made decisions he would never fully understand, but who had left the door cracked just enough for him to walk back through. That night, after the boys had fallen asleep with popcorn between the sheets and cartoon voices still echoing from the television, Henry sat at the small desk in the corner of the suite. He opened his laptop and typed a message to his board of directors. It was short and clear. He was taking a leave of absence. Effective immediately. Personal reasons. He closed the computer before he could second-guess it. Then he walked into the boys' room, turned off the television, and pulled the blankets over each of them. Joshua had his arms sprawled across Logan, and Sam had one hand curled around a toy car. Henry watched them for a long time, the room full of their quiet breaths and the kind of peace he had once believed was impossible to earn. He didn't know what kind of father he would be. He didn't have a plan for what came next. But for the first time in his life, he wasn't afraid of the uncertainty. He was building something, not out of power or control, but out of presence. Out of moments. Out of love that arrived late, but fully formed. And he wasn't going anywhere. Henry's house hadn't changed in years. It was a sleek, modern space in the quiet hills outside the city, where glass walls reflected trees and silence ruled the hallways. Everything inside was carefully curated, neutral tones, steel accents, and not a single item out of place. It had been his sanctuary, a monument to discipline and detachment. But standing in the entryway with 3 boys at his side, backpacks slung over their shoulders and mismatched shoes squeaking on the polished floors, the house suddenly felt like it belonged to someone else. He watched them step inside hesitantly, eyes darting over the towering ceilings and spotless surfaces. Logan paused by a wall of books, Sam ran his fingers along the edge of a leather couch, and Joshua, still moving more slowly as he recovered, sank carefully into the nearest armchair and looked around as though waiting for someone to say they didn't belong there. Henry cleared his throat. "It's yours now. All of it. You don't have to be careful." The boys didn't reply, but something in their posture softened just slightly. In the following days, the house transformed, not because Henry forced it to, but because the presence of children simply refused to be ignored. There were shoes left by the door, drawings taped to the fridge, stuffed animals peeking from behind curtains, and a soccer ball that somehow always ended up in the dining room. Henry stopped adjusting cushions after they were disturbed, stopped wincing at handprints on glass, and started noticing the laughter that echoed down hallways that had once known only quiet. Meals became an adventure. He tried to cook a few times and failed spectacularly. The boys didn't seem to mind the burned toast or undercooked pasta, mostly because they were fascinated by the idea of a man in a suit trying to learn how to flip pancakes. Eventually, he hired a part-time cook, not to take over, but to teach him. He wanted to learn. He wanted to be there for everything, even the parts he didn't know how to do yet. At night, they piled onto the massive sectional in the living room, choosing movies with loud soundtracks and ridiculous plots. Sam fell asleep first every time, curled in a corner with his feet tucked under Henry's leg. Joshua stayed awake longer, asking questions about everything from space to animals to why water boiled. Logan was always the last to speak, but when he did, it was usually to thank Henry for something small: clean socks, a warm blanket, a ride to the park. Henry kept meeting with lawyers. The guardianship process moved forward, and eventually, he filed for full adoption. The paperwork was extensive. The interviews were intrusive. There were moments when he felt like he was being tested for something no one could ever fully prepare for. But every time someone asked, "Why are you doing this?" he answered honestly. "Because I should have been there from the start. And I won't miss another day." One afternoon, while reorganizing the boys' closet with Logan, Henry opened a small box he didn't recognize. Inside were old photos, folded notes, and a hospital bracelet. Logan looked up and said, "Mom kept it all. She just didn't know if we'd ever find you." Henry ran his fingers over a picture of Abby holding 3 tiny infants, eyes tired but proud. It was the first time he'd seen her in years. He closed the box gently and told Logan he was glad she did. The boys started school a few weeks later. The first day, Henry stood outside the front gate watching them disappear into the crowd of children. He felt a strange ache in his chest, not fear, not sadness, but something closer to pride. They were walking into the world with heads held high, no longer invisible. That evening, they brought home stories and drawings and a note from the teacher saying, "They talk about you all the time. Whatever you're doing, it's working." That night, after they had all gone to bed, Henry sat alone in the kitchen with a cup of tea he didn't remember making. The house was quiet again, but not empty. There was life in every corner now, proof of joy layered over grief, of growth built on ruins he hadn't even known were his to rebuild. He didn't think of himself as a savior. He didn't want credit. He just knew that the man he used to be, cold, distant, defined by success, no longer existed in this space. This version of him was learning. This version of him was real. And this home, chaotic and noisy and full of crumbs, was finally where he belonged. It was early spring when Henry received a small package with no return address. The envelope was handwritten and slightly weathered, sealed with care but clearly aged. He almost didn't open it, assuming it was a delayed delivery or misplaced correspondence from one of the many legal channels he'd been navigating. But when he saw the name Abby Monroe written in delicate, slanted letters on the top page inside, his breath caught. The letter wasn't recent. It was dated more than a year ago, long before the boys had entered his life. And yet, somehow, it had found its way to him. He read it alone in his office, the one room in the house that still looked like the version of himself he used to be, orderly, untouched by the laughter and fingerprints that now filled the rest of the home. The letter was short, but honest in a way that twisted something deep inside his chest. Abby had written it when she'd already known she was sick. She hadn't said what exactly, only that her time felt short. She wrote that she didn't know if he'd ever read this, or if he even remembered her. She told him she had 3 sons, his sons, and that she didn't regret keeping them, even though it had been hard. She hadn't told him because she thought he wouldn't care, or worse, would see them as a burden. But she hoped that if they ever found him, if the universe somehow connected them again, he'd try to understand. Henry folded the letter and held it in both hands, sitting very still. He thought of the boys, of Sam's curious eyes, of Logan's quiet strength, of Joshua's stubborn resilience, and wondered how different everything might have been if he'd received this letter earlier. But regret was not the emotion that stayed with him the longest. What lingered was gratitude. Not just for the truth, but for the fact that Abby had believed, even in her final days, that he might become the man she had once hoped he would be. He didn't tell the boys about the letter immediately. He wasn't sure if it would hurt or comfort them, and he didn't want to bring back pain they had only just begun to move through. But a few nights later, during a rainy evening when the power flickered and they were all curled up on the couch with flashlights and a board game, Logan asked a quiet question. "Do you think Mom knew you'd find us?" Henry hesitated. Then he reached for the envelope he'd kept in the drawer behind him and handed it to Logan. "I think she hoped," he said. "And I think she was right to." They read it together, the boys pressing close to see the small, slanted handwriting. Sam asked if he could keep it in his room. Henry said yes. That night, they didn't ask for a story before bed. Instead, Logan turned off the light, and the three of them sat in silence, as if remembering something they hadn't lived, but still somehow carried. In the following days, Henry noticed a shift. The boys seemed a little more anchored, like knowing that their mother had made a choice to protect them, even if it meant leaving questions unanswered, gave them permission to let go of the fear that she had abandoned them. They talked about her more openly. Sam asked if she liked music. Joshua asked if she had ever cooked spaghetti wrong. Logan wanted to know what she had been like when she was happy. Henry answered the best he could, sometimes guessing, sometimes remembering. He didn't pretend to know everything. He just made space for her to live in their home the only way she could now, through stories, drawings, and small keepsakes tucked into dresser drawers. On the last Sunday of the month, they planted a tree in the backyard. It wasn't for ceremony or closure. It was just something they wanted to do. Sam picked a flowering cherry because he said it looked like a tree from one of his picture books. They dug the hole together, Henry doing most of the work while the boys handed him tools and argued about who would water it first. When it was done, they stood in a circle around the small, trembling sapling and didn't say anything for a while. The wind moved gently through the branches. It was quiet, but not heavy. It felt like the kind of silence that holds memory rather than pain. Later that night, when Henry walked past the boys' room to turn off the hall light, he heard Logan's voice, not whispering but steady. "I think Mom would have liked it here." And Henry, standing alone in the hallway, smiled, not the polished smile of a man closing a deal, but the quiet one of someone who had finally come home. The 1-year anniversary of the day Henry met the boys arrived with little ceremony, but its weight was undeniable. He hadn't marked the date on a calendar, and no one said anything about it out loud, but it was there in the way he paused when passing the front door that morning, the same place he had once opened to strangers who turned out to be his sons. It was in the way Logan lingered a little longer at breakfast, or how Sam kept asking to look at old photos, or how Joshua, usually full of chatter, seemed unusually still. Henry didn't plan a celebration. He didn't know how to. But when the boys came home from school and found a stack of new board games on the table, a handmade cake in the kitchen, and 3 small gift boxes labeled only with their names, they understood. It wasn't about balloons or decorations. It was about presents. It was about making sure they knew that this day meant something, even if it wasn't called anything official. That evening, they ate dinner on the patio under strings of soft lights Henry had hung himself, awkwardly and unevenly, the week before. The meal was simple, grilled burgers, fries, lemonade, but the table was full of laughter and teasing and ketchup-stained napkins. Sam dropped a tomato slice into his lap. Joshua tried to convince everyone he'd grown 2 inches. Logan asked if they could play one of the new games outside in the dark. Henry said yes to everything. After they cleared the dishes and brought out the cake, Henry stood for a moment, unsure of whether to say anything. But Logan looked up and said, "Is this the day we met you?" Henry nodded, then cleared his throat and replied, "It's the day everything changed." The boys didn't ask him to explain. They didn't need to. They knew what he meant. When the stars came out, they moved to the grass and lay in a row, staring up at the night sky. Henry lay between Joshua and Sam, with Logan just beside them. Sam reached for his hand without saying anything, and Henry held it, surprised still at how natural that felt. They talked about space, about whether anyone could live on Mars, about what it would be like to float in zero gravity. Joshua asked what stars were made of, and Henry gave the scientific answer, but Sam interrupted with, "I think they're just memories that glow." No one argued. The quiet that followed felt whole. Later, when the boys were in bed and the house was calm again, Henry walked through each room and turned off the lights slowly. He picked up a sock in the hallway, a toy robot in the bathroom, a drawing that had slipped off the fridge. He didn't mind the clutter. It wasn't disorder, it was evidence. Proof that his home was full of life. He stepped out onto the back porch with a cup of tea and looked at the tree they had planted months ago. It had grown just a little, its thin branches reaching upward with the stubborn grace of something that had survived its first storm. Henry watched it for a long time, remembering the version of himself who had once stood on a street corner, indifferent to everything but his schedule. He couldn't reconcile that man with the one he was now, and he didn't want to. He had been successful, wealthy, respected, but none of those things had made him complete. The boys had. Not by filling a void, but by showing him one had always been there. They had never asked him to be perfect. They had only asked him to stay. And he had. Every day since. As the wind shifted and the porch lights flickered gently, Henry smiled. Not because everything was easy or fixed or flawless. But because, for the first time in his life, everything truly mattered. And he finally knew who he was. A father. A home. A second chance he would never let go of. He was just steps from his office when two little girls stopped him, one silent, the other lifting her sleeve to reveal a birthmark identical to his. They didn't say the words, but he already knew. Grayson Miller was always in motion. His mornings began before the sun, filled with emails, market updates, and perfectly timed meetings. He thrived on precision, on momentum, on results. As the CEO of one of the city's most powerful investment firms, he didn't allow room for hesitation. That morning was no different. With a crisp navy suit, polished shoes, and his usual stoic expression, he walked swiftly through the bustling financial district toward his office tower. His phone buzzed in his hand, and he answered a quick call, giving short, focused instructions to a junior executive. The meeting ahead was critical, an international merger that had taken weeks to orchestrate. Every minute mattered. He was just a few steps from the glass doors of the skyscraper when a small voice cut through the noise of the street. "Excuse me." He stopped and turned instinctively, scanning the area for who had spoken. That's when he saw them, two little girls standing near the building's front steps. They couldn't have been more than 5 years old. Identical, with long brown hair in messy ponytails, green eyes too large for their small faces, and pastel green dresses that hung slightly crooked over their small frames. They were barefoot. One was clutching the other's hand tightly, and for a moment, Grayson thought they might be lost children, except something in their expression was startlingly calm. The one on the left stepped forward. Without saying another word, she raised the sleeve of her dress and pointed to her wrist. Grayson blinked. There, on her skin, was a dark, crescent-shaped birthmark. He knew it immediately, he had the exact same one in the exact same spot. His stomach twisted. The girl looked up at him and said in a quiet, certain voice, "You're our dad." For a long moment, Grayson couldn't move. His entire body felt paralyzed by the impossible. He stared at them, searching their faces for familiarity, for a trick, for anything that would explain what he was seeing. But he couldn't deny it, the eyes, the hair, the shape of their faces. They looked like him. Not just a little. Unmistakably. He finally found his voice, though it came out hoarse. "Who are you? Where is your mother?" The second girl, the quieter of the two, answered. "She's in the hospital. She got hurt. 2 days ago. We ran away from Grandma to find you." Grayson's mind reeled. He tried to make sense of their words, but nothing fit neatly into the world he knew. He crouched down slowly to their level. "How did you know where to find me?" The girl with the birthmark shrugged. "Mom told us your name." She said if anything ever happened, we should come find you. So we did. Behind them, the city kept moving, cars honking, people talking, the morning rushing forward like it always did, but for Grayson, everything had stopped. His carefully planned day, his empire of schedules and control, was now shattered by two tiny voices and a birthmark he had never shown anyone outside his family. He looked at them again, seeing not strangers, but two pieces of something lost. He didn't know what to do next. But he knew one thing with terrifying clarity. He couldn't walk away. Grayson led the girls away from the front steps of the office tower, his mind racing as fast as his heart. He didn't know where he was going, only that he couldn't leave them standing there in the middle of the business district. Just a block away was a quiet cafe he sometimes used for private meetings, one of the few places nearby where the noise of the city seemed to soften. He guided the girls through the morning crowd, shielding them instinctively with his body as if danger might come from any direction. Once inside, he picked the quietest corner booth and ordered 2 hot chocolates and a coffee, his hands trembling slightly as he reached for the sugar. The girls climbed onto the booth bench without hesitation, sitting close together, their legs swinging over the edge. When the drinks arrived, he finally looked at them closely. Their names, he realized, were still a mystery. He asked gently, and the one with the birthmark answered first. "I'm Emily," she said, wrapping both hands around the warm mug. The other girl added softly, "And I'm Lily." They looked at him with wide, expectant eyes, not fearful but full of something deeper, hope, maybe, or certainty. He asked them again where their mother was. Emily explained that their mom, Sarah, had been in a car accident 2 days earlier. She was taken to the hospital and hadn't woken up since. The girls had been with their grandmother, but they said she didn't want them to visit their mother or talk about their father. "Grandma said you wouldn't want us," Lily whispered, her voice small but steady. "But Mom said if something happened, we had to find you. So we did." Grayson sat back, stunned. Sarah. The name hit him like a wave. He hadn't heard it in 5 years, not since their brief relationship had ended with a sudden, painful silence. She had left without explanation, and he, in the middle of a rising career, had buried her memory beneath layers of work. He had always wondered why she vanished, but he never chased the answer. Now, 2 girls with his eyes were sitting across from him, drinking hot chocolate and telling him that Sarah had raised them alone, and he had missed every moment of it. He tried to stay calm, asking careful questions. How did they find him? Emily said their mother had once shown them a magazine with his photo in it, said his name, told them that if they ever needed help and couldn't find her, he was the one to look for. They remembered the name. They remembered the photo. They had walked for blocks after sneaking out of their grandmother's house in the suburbs, asking for directions until someone pointed them toward his building. Grayson felt the walls of his old life closing in and being pushed out all at once. This wasn't just an interruption. It was a revelation. He had children. Not a child, children. Twins. Daughters who had been living in a world he hadn't known existed. He didn't know how to react. His body moved on instinct, but his heart hadn't caught up yet. He asked them what they wanted now. Emily looked at him with unwavering focus and said, "We need your help. We don't want to go back to Grandma. She says bad things about Mommy. We want to see her. And we want to stay with you until she wakes up." Grayson's voice caught in his throat. He had no answers yet, no plans, no legal rights. But as he looked at the girls, Sarah's children, his daughters, he knew he couldn't send them away. The question wasn't whether he would help. It was how fast he could begin. He pulled out his phone and called his assistant, canceling every meeting on his calendar. Then he began searching every hospital in the city until he found one with an unidentified patient named Sarah Miller. He confirmed it with her birth date. She had been in a car accident just outside her neighborhood, listed in stable condition but still unconscious. He turned back to the girls. "I found her," he said quietly. "She's okay. We're going to see her." Emily and Lily reached across the table and grabbed his hands like it was the most natural thing in the world. And Grayson, who had once led billion-dollar negotiations without blinking, felt himself begin to tremble, not from fear, but from something far more unfamiliar. He was becoming a father. And there was no turning back. The hospital was only 15 minutes from the cafe, but the ride there felt longer than anything Grayson had experienced in years. Emily and Lily sat quietly in the back seat, staring out the windows, their hands folded neatly in their laps. The silence wasn't uncomfortable, it was heavy with the kind of emotion that children aren't always able to name. Grayson glanced at them through the rearview mirror several times, trying to process how they had fit so seamlessly into his car, into this moment, into his life. With each red light, with each passing street sign, the reality deepened. He was bringing his daughters to see their mother, a woman he hadn't spoken to in half a decade, a woman he had once cared for deeply and then let slip away without fully understanding why. When they arrived at the hospital, he guided them through the busy lobby and toward the ICU wing, his hand steady on Emily's shoulder while Lily gripped the edge of his jacket. The nurse at the front desk asked for identification and patient information, and when Grayson gave Sarah's name, the woman nodded with quiet recognition. "She's in room 416, the nurse said. "Still unconscious, but stable. Visiting hours are limited, and children aren't technically allowed inside unless approved by the physician. But I'll see what I can do." She glanced at the girls, and her expression softened. "You might be the first family she's had visit." The phrase struck him harder than he expected. First family. The girls had said they'd been kept away, that their grandmother didn't allow them to see their mother. Grayson's throat tightened as he looked down at the two little faces watching him. They didn't say anything, but their eyes were asking for reassurance he hadn't yet figured out how to give. They waited in a quiet room just outside the ICU, the walls painted with faded landscapes, the chairs stiff and uncomfortable. Grayson sat between them, letting their small bodies lean into his arms, silently anchoring themselves to someone they were only beginning to know. He didn't speak, didn't fill the silence with promises he couldn't yet make. He just stayed with them. After what felt like hours, though it was only 30 minutes, the nurse returned and said softly, "She's still resting, but you can come in one at a time for a few minutes. I'll make sure the doctor knows you're here." Grayson stood and gently asked who wanted to go first. Emily stepped forward without hesitation, her chin lifted slightly, her shoulders stiff with determination. The nurse led them to room 416, and Grayson paused in the doorway as Emily entered alone. He watched her small figure move to the side of the hospital bed, where Sarah lay surrounded by monitors and soft beeping machines. Emily reached for her mother's hand and just held it, whispering something he couldn't hear from where he stood. She didn't cry. She simply stood there, strong and silent. A few minutes later, Lily went in. She moved more hesitantly, her body smaller in the space, and when she touched her mother's hand, she immediately buried her face into the bedsheet. Grayson ached watching it. After Lily returned to the hallway, he entered the room alone. For a moment, he stood at the foot of the bed, staring at Sarah. Her face was thinner than he remembered. Bruises darkened the edge of her hairline. Her hands were pale against the white sheets. But it was her. The woman he'd once fallen for, the woman who had walked away silently, now lay still and unreachable. He moved closer, sitting carefully in the chair beside her. He didn't touch her yet. He wasn't sure if he had the right. Instead, he spoke softly, unsure if she could hear him but needing to say the words anyway. "You should have told me," he said. "But maybe I should have listened harder. I don't know what happened, why you felt like you had to disappear. But they found me. Our girls. They're brave and stubborn and smart, and they walked straight into my life like they were always meant to be there." He paused, trying to steady his voice. "They need you to wake up. I think I need that too." He stayed a few minutes longer, then returned to the girls, who were now curled together on a bench in the waiting room, their eyes heavy with exhaustion. He sat between them again, and this time, they leaned into him without hesitation. Lily took his hand. Emily rested her head on his arm. They didn't need him to say anything. They just needed him to stay. And that, for the first time in his life, was exactly what he wanted to do. Grayson didn't return to his office that day. In fact, he didn't even check his phone for hours. He had spent his entire career building a world where control was everything, tight schedules, predictable outcomes, measured risk, but now, none of it seemed to matter. His daughters were asleep in the back seat of his car, huddled under a borrowed hospital blanket, and their mother was lying unconscious in a room that smelled like antiseptic and uncertainty. For once, Grayson didn't feel like solving anything. He just felt the weight of it. Instead of going back to his penthouse, he took them to a quiet, mid-range hotel near the hospital. He didn't want to bring them into a place filled with sterile glass and cold marble floors. His home wasn't ready for them. He wasn't ready. So he booked a 2-room suite, bought them grilled cheese sandwiches and apple slices from the cafe downstairs, and let them fall asleep watching an old cartoon on the bed. He sat in the chair by the window, watching the city lights blink and blur, listening to the soft rhythm of their breathing. It was the first time in years he didn't feel alone, and yet the feeling terrified him. The next morning, he called his assistant and gave instructions he never thought he'd give. He cleared his schedule for 2 weeks. He postponed international meetings. He asked for files to be forwarded but made no promise to open them. Something came up, he said. And that was all. Then he turned his attention fully to the girls. He took them shopping for clothes and proper shoes, trying his best to guess their sizes. It was awkward and clumsy. He had no idea what little girls liked, which colors were acceptable, or how to choose between sparkly and plain. But he let them lead. He listened when Emily said pink made her feel too loud, and when Lily whispered that green was mommy's favorite. He watched them walk in and out of fitting rooms like they had done this before, like they had learned to take care of themselves too early. Afterward, he bought school supplies even though they weren't sure when they would go back. He got them books and stuffed animals, snacks they could choose themselves, and a backpack each, because they both insisted on carrying their own things now that we're staying with you. The words hit him harder than he let on. They said it with such certainty, like it had already been decided. Back at the hotel, they organized their new things, arguing over which drawer was whose, which bed they would share, and whether the stuffed giraffe belonged to both of them or just Lily. Grayson sat nearby, observing, feeling like a guest in someone else's life. But slowly, hour by hour, something shifted. They asked him to help open juice boxes. They told him stories about their mother, how she sang off-key in the kitchen, how she cried during sad commercials, how she always made pancakes on Fridays. That night, Emily asked him if he used to love their mom. The question came out casually, as if she were asking what time breakfast would be. He was quiet for a long moment, then said yes. Very much, he added. But I didn't know how to show it the right way back then. Lily, listening from across the room, asked if he still loved her. He didn't answer immediately. Then he said, I think I'm learning how to. The next day, Grayson arranged a visit with the hospital social worker. He told her everything, about Sarah, about the girls, about how they'd found him. She asked if he wanted to pursue legal custody if Sarah remained unconscious. He hesitated for a moment before saying, yes, if it comes to that. He didn't say it out of obligation. He meant it. By the end of the week, they had developed a kind of rhythm. Mornings began with cereal and cartoons. Afternoons were filled with short walks, quiet moments in bookstores, and visits to the hospital. The nurses began recognizing the girls. One of them even brought coloring pages for them to do while waiting outside their mother's room. Every day, they took turns sitting beside Sarah's bed, talking to her, drawing pictures, telling her how they had spent the day. And every day, Grayson sat in that chair afterward, holding her hand when the girls had gone, telling her about the world she couldn't yet see. He didn't know if she could hear him. But he hoped. Because he was beginning to understand what love actually looked like, not as a promise made once, but as a decision made again and again, especially when no one else was watching. On the 8th day, something changed. It wasn't loud or dramatic, but it shifted everything. Grayson and the girls had arrived at the hospital as they always did in the late morning. The twins had fallen into a routine, taking turns sitting quietly in their mother's ICU room, whispering their thoughts, sometimes just resting their small hands on hers. That day, it was Lily who went in first. Grayson sat outside with Emily, who was drawing a picture of a treehouse, one they'd seen in a book the night before. 10 minutes later, Lily came rushing out of the room, her eyes wide and breath quick. She grabbed his hand and whispered, "I think Mommy moved." Grayson stood up instantly. He didn't want to hope too fast, didn't want to scare them if it was just a reflex, but something about Lily's voice made him believe her. He asked the nurse on duty to check, and together they returned to the room. Sarah was still lying motionless, but the heart monitor had slightly quickened. Grayson moved closer, quietly said her name, and watched in disbelief as her eyelids fluttered and opened halfway. Her eyes searched the room, unfocused at first, then catching his. They didn't show panic, only confusion. She blinked again, trying to speak, but only a raspy breath came out. The nurse checked her vitals quickly, murmuring instructions into her comms, but Grayson remained at her side, stunned by the fragile, undeniable truth: she was waking up. The girls weren't allowed back in the room yet, but he assured them outside that their mother had opened her eyes. That was enough to bring Emily to tears, the first real ones he'd seen from her since the day they met. Lily sat very still, whispering, "I knew it," to herself over and over, like a chant she'd been holding on to in secret. Grayson sat between them in the waiting room, arms around both of their shoulders, and they stayed like that until the doctor came out to confirm the progress. Over the next 24 hours, Sarah began to regain more consciousness. She couldn't speak much, but she nodded, held their hands, followed simple instructions. The girls were allowed brief visits. They didn't bombard her with questions. They didn't cry. They simply held her and told her about all the things she'd missed, how Grayson let them eat spaghetti in bed once, how they bought new pajamas, how they learned the names of every nurse in the hospital. Sarah listened, her eyes brimming with emotion, squeezing their hands as if she never wanted to let go again. Later that night, after the girls had fallen asleep at the hotel, Grayson returned to the hospital alone. Sarah was resting but awake when he entered. Her voice was barely there, but she managed to whisper his name. He pulled the chair closer, unsure how much to say, how much she could handle. She beat him to it. "I didn't want to disappear," she whispered. "I thought I was doing the right thing." He swallowed hard, his voice quiet. "You left without a word. I thought I'd done something wrong. I never imagined you were carrying our children." She turned her head slowly toward him. "You were so far away. I didn't want to be a weight on you. You were building a world I didn't belong in." "You always did," he said. "I just didn't know how to hold on to it back then." Sarah looked at him for a long moment, tears beginning to form again. "They found you," she whispered. "I didn't know if they would, but I told them anyway. They walked straight into my life and didn't blink," he said, almost laughing through the tightness in his chest. "They changed everything." They sat in silence for a while, the machines humming softly around them. Grayson reached for her hand, this time without hesitation. She didn't pull away. He told her what the girls had done each day, how he had tried to learn what to feed them, how to braid their hair, how to keep their nightmares at bay without knowing what to say. He told her how he'd put his company on hold and how none of it mattered now. He had found something bigger than business. Something more important than success. When it was time to leave, he stood and kissed the back of her hand. She squeezed his fingers and whispered, "Don't go far." He promised he wouldn't. And for the first time in years, he meant it without reservation. The next few days brought cautious optimism. Sarah's condition continued to improve, slowly but steadily. Her voice grew stronger, her movements more coordinated, and her presence more alive with each hour that passed. The doctors remained careful in their assessments, warning that recovery would take time and might come with complications, but Sarah met every small milestone with quiet determination. She asked about the girls constantly, even when she was too tired to stay awake long enough to hear the answers. Grayson visited 3 times a day, once alone in the early morning, once with the girls in the afternoon, and again at night when they were asleep. Emily and Lily began to settle into a routine with him that neither of them questioned. They started calling the hotel "our place" and divided tasks between them. Emily would check if the towels were folded, Lily would count the forks. They still asked about their mom every day, but the fear in their voices had faded. In its place was cautious hope and growing trust. They laughed more. They argued like sisters again, not like girls carrying too much weight. Grayson saw the change in them and knew it wasn't just because Sarah was healing. It was because they had begun to feel safe. He did everything he could to protect that feeling. He talked with lawyers about temporary guardianship and began researching schools near his home in case they needed to stay long-term. He even called a child psychologist for advice on how to support twins who had experienced so much uncertainty. Everything he did now was filtered through a new lens: what would make their lives easier, more stable, more joyful. He didn't think of it as sacrifice. He thought of it as a second chance. When Sarah was finally moved out of ICU into a private room, Grayson brought the girls in for a full visit. It was the first time they had seen her sitting up, hair washed, eyes clearer, wrapped in a robe instead of tubes. The moment the girls saw her, they sprinted forward and clung to her like magnets. Sarah kissed the tops of their heads, held them close with a strength she barely had, and whispered over and over, "I'm here, I'm here, I'm here." Grayson stood near the window, watching the scene unfold. It was the most beautiful and painful thing he had seen in a long time. He knew this wasn't the end of their struggle. Sarah would need therapy, medication, possibly even additional surgery. The girls would need time to process everything. And he would have to learn what it really meant to be a father beyond these intense weeks. But standing there, watching the 3 of them melt into each other, he also knew one thing with absolute clarity. He wanted to be in this for the long haul. Later that evening, after the girls had returned to the hotel with a nurse who offered to help for a few hours, Grayson sat with Sarah again, this time without a clock ticking behind him. They spoke more openly now. She asked questions about the girls, what they liked to eat, which one had nightmares, how he had managed bedtime without completely losing control. He told her everything, even the mistakes, like when he accidentally used shampoo as body wash or when he burned a grilled cheese sandwich so badly the girls begged him never to cook again. She laughed, really laughed, for the first time since waking up. It was a sound he had missed without realizing it, one that filled the space between them with something that felt less like nostalgia and more like a beginning. Then the conversation shifted. Sarah grew quiet, looking at the 4-line in her arm before speaking. "Do you want to be part of this? Not just now, but after I leave here?" Grayson didn't hesitate. "Yes. Not because I have to. Because I want to." "You're not the same man I left," she said. "I hope not," he replied. "Because back then, I didn't understand what mattered. Now I do." They sat in silence after that, but it wasn't heavy. It was full of unspoken agreement, of trust that had been rebuilt piece by piece in hospital rooms and bedtime routines. When he finally left, he kissed her forehead gently, the way he had once done years ago, and she didn't flinch or pull away. She closed her eyes with a smile and whispered, "See you tomorrow." And this time, it wasn't a farewell. It was a promise. A week later, Sarah was discharged from the hospital. The doctors wanted her to continue outpatient therapy and take things slow, but she was well enough to walk, to speak clearly, and most importantly, to be with her daughters again. Grayson had spent the previous few days transforming his home from the sterile, minimalist space it had once been into something warmer, something livable, something ready for 3 more people. He'd cleared out his office and turned it into a room with 2 small beds and a bookshelf lined with picture books and stuffed animals. He stocked the fridge with juice boxes, strawberries, and the yogurt the girls insisted on eating every morning. He even had blackout curtains installed in the master bedroom so Sarah could rest as much as she needed without being disturbed by morning light. When he brought her home, it was the first time in years he had looked at his house and thought of it as something more than just a place to sleep. It was finally becoming a home. The girls helped her up the front steps, holding each hand with a quiet, proud excitement. They showed her their new room, pointed out the drawer full of art supplies, and demonstrated how they'd labeled their toothbrushes with stickers. Sarah watched them with a mixture of amazement and heartbreak, realizing how much she'd missed and how quickly they had adapted. Later that evening, they all sat together on the couch, eating dinner off their laps and watching a movie. Sarah leaned gently against Grayson's shoulder, her body still recovering, but her spirit more grounded than he had ever seen it. It wasn't perfection. It wasn't easy. But it was real. Grayson made a decision the next day. He submitted his resignation letter to the board of his company, not with regret, but with conviction. He would remain a partner and consultant, but the day-to-day demands were over. He had spent too many years believing that success looked like glass offices, power meetings, and jet lag. Now he knew better. Success was Lily falling asleep with a book on her chest. It was Emily asking him to tie her shoes because you do it tighter than anyone else. It was Sarah standing in his kitchen, making tea while humming a song she used to sing to the girls when they were babies. This life, imperfect and loud and full of things he didn't yet know how to do, was more fulfilling than anything he had built before. Sarah had her good days and her quiet ones. Some mornings, she didn't speak much and needed to rest longer. Other days, she danced in the kitchen with the girls and let them braid her hair. Grayson didn't try to fix anything. He simply supported. He learned that presence was more powerful than advice. That being there, even silently, meant more than offering the perfect answer. They attended their first school meeting as a family. The teacher noted how quickly the girls were adjusting and how much they talked about Daddy Grayson. Hearing the word stunned him. He hadn't told them to call him that. He hadn't asked for it. But they had chosen it. It wasn't a title. It was trust. That night, as they all sat together playing a board game on the living room floor, Sarah looked over at him with a knowing smile. "You're different," she said quietly, almost as if she were surprised by it herself. "I feel different," he admitted. "You're softer," she said. "I've had good teachers," he replied, nodding toward the twins who were loudly debating over the game rules. Later, after the girls were asleep and the house was quiet, Sarah and Grayson sat on the back porch wrapped in a shared blanket. The sky above them was full of stars, and the air was thick with the scent of spring. Sarah looked at him and said, "I don't want to do any of this alone anymore." "You won't," he said. She nodded, reaching for his hand. They didn't talk much after that. They didn't need to. Everything had already been said, not in words, but in actions. In showing up, in staying through the hard days, in choosing one another again not out of obligation, but because the life they were slowly building was better than anything they had known apart. And as the night wrapped around them like a promise, Grayson knew with quiet certainty that this was the life he had waited for all along. He just hadn't known what to call it until now. A year passed more quickly than anyone expected. What had once felt like crisis and chaos slowly evolved into routine. Not a perfect one, there were still late mornings, spilled juice on homework, and arguments over who got the last pancake, but a rhythm had formed. Grayson no longer checked financial reports before brushing teeth or left mid-conversation to answer calls. Instead, his mornings began with small feet thudding down the hallway and sleepy voices asking if it was a school day. His evenings ended with braiding hair, cleaning glitter from the dining table, and reading the same story twice because the second time is funnier. Life had changed, and he had changed with it. Emily and Lily had grown more confident, more curious, and far more outspoken. They loved science kits, sticker books, and performing songs they made up on the spot in the living room. They still shared a room, still argued over toys, and still managed to gang up on him when they wanted something. Grayson no longer felt like a guest in their lives. He was part of their ecosystem. They came to him with every scraped knee, every wild idea, every whispered fear in the dark. And while he still didn't know how to braid perfectly or always remember which one liked which sandwich cut, he was there, and they never questioned it. Sarah's recovery had been steady. She regained her strength, started working part-time at a local community center, and slowly returned to herself. There were still moments of fatigue, days when she needed space or rest, but she had found balance. She had also found her voice again, not just as a mother, but as someone who allowed herself to lean on someone else without feeling weak. Her relationship with Grayson wasn't based on nostalgia or second chances, it was rooted in everything they had survived and everything they were choosing now, day by day. They didn't rush into anything romantic. It came gradually. It came in cups of coffee passed silently during stressful mornings, in shared glances at school events, in quiet laughter during late-night cleanups. They fell into love the way some people fall into sleep, naturally, without realizing it until they were already deep in it. One evening, after the girls had gone to bed, Sarah turned to him and said, "This is what I thought it could be, once. Back then." And he answered without hesitation, "This is what I never knew I needed." That was the night they began to plan a future, not around what they had lost, but what they were now building together. On the twins' 6th birthday, they threw a party in the backyard. There were paper lanterns strung across the trees, homemade cupcakes stacked like a tower, and a magician who botched almost every trick but made the kids laugh anyway. Sarah stood beside Grayson, hand in his, both of them watching the girls run barefoot through the grass with crowns made of cardboard and tape. At one point, Lily tugged on Grayson's jacket and asked, "Are you going to stay forever?" He knelt beside her and said, "Longer than that, if you'll let me." She smiled and ran off before he could say more. That night, after the guests were gone and the sun had dipped beneath the trees, the four of them sat on a blanket in the yard, watching fireflies blink in the dusk. Sarah rested her head on his shoulder, and the girls leaned against her sides, drowsy but happy. Grayson looked at them, all of them, and felt something close in his chest, not panic or fear, but awe. The life he had almost missed out on had become the only one that mattered. No one said anything profound. There were no speeches, no declarations. There was just the soft hum of crickets, the quiet breathing of children, and the weight of a future built not on perfection but on presence. And in that moment, Grayson understood the most important truth of all: love wasn't in what you said, but in how you stayed.